My name is Erica Clites. I think I've met most all of you now. And I'm the director of the Oakland County CISMA, and I'll talk a little bit more about what CISMAs are. So I'm going to give you a little bit about invasive species. Amy kind of covered this, so I'll just go through with some more examples. I'm going to talk about CISMAs in this area of Michigan, and then I'm going to talk about some specific species that Amy mentioned in terms of knotweed, Phragmites, purple loosestrife, and then the Watchlist aquatic species. And then again, I'm not going to go over the whole prohibited restricted species list because it's pretty long, but I will talk about that a little bit as well. So we covered this in terms of invasive species being those that are non-native and that cause harm. It does cover anything from like algae to a plant to an animal to a fungus. So it doesn't matter what type of organism it is to be invasive. Amy kind of covered this as well, but just to go over real quick. So the reason invasive species are a problem is because they come from somewhere else and they have few natural competitors here. And thus, they often go totally out of control, like in this picture. Many of them can change the soil chemistry. They actually release chemicals into the soil that makes it difficult for other plants to grow there. And they unbalance ecosystems and harm wildlife. So here's an example. We talked about Asian bittersweet vines. So that's one I didn't put specifically in the presentation, but Asian bittersweet is a woody vine that can actually strangle trees because it'll wind around them so tightly that it'll just eventually kill the tree. And in winter, this is one that you might see. There is a native bittersweet in Michigan, but it's not that common. So it's pretty likely if someone was making Rees that it's the Asian, the invasive bittersweet. Yeah. One of the things that we're also very concerned about is the damage that invasives cause to infrastructure. So I'll talk about these plants a little more, but this is Phragmites growing up through boardwalks. They can grow through asphalt. Knotweed is a really nasty one, and that's the main one, actually. The reason that we wanted to host this talk was because last year somebody was selling knotweed not as a plant, but as like actually a food product. Looks kind of like asparagus, and it is edible, but this is a plant that it comes from volcanic soils and can literally grow through house foundations, concrete, basically anything. So we don't want this spreading more in Michigan. Invasive plants also often limit access to water and recreation, which is, of course, many of the things people like in Oakland County. So we've really seen Phragmites have a big invasion of the area. So this is the same wetland in 1990 and 2012. And this is common in this area. If people haven't done something to try to keep it out, the lakes, wetland areas especially, Phragmites will just fill in the entire wetland. Lakes, it'll fill in a loop around the outside of the lake. So these are not nice plants, both for the environment, but also for all the reasons that we like to enjoy our outdoor areas. Yeah, so this is just making the point in terms of property value. Of course, if you live on the lake, you want to be able to actually get to the lake. There's also some fire hazards with Phragmites. So because it can grow in these big fields of it, and because it's a grass, it's very dry in the winter. So this time of year, so if it were to catch on fire, which has actually happened in Oakland County before, there was a gas line break near Great Lakes Crossing Mall a couple years ago, and it actually caught a field of Phragmites on fire. And it was basically uncontrollable because it burns so hot that firefighters can't really do very much with it. So they just had to evacuate all the buildings in the area. They had to close the highway for a while. So it was really a mess. So that's not something we like. And then from a road standpoint, you can see how tall it is. So we also work with the road commission to treat it along roadways, because otherwise sometimes you get to an intersection and you can't see on the other side of the intersection. So from our natural community standpoint, we're going from what's actually a complex natural environment, which looks maybe more like this, to something that's really simple. So invasive plants also often create what we call a monoculture, which just means it's just one plant. And there's almost nothing that can live in Phragmites like this. Like turtles actually get stuck crawling through it because they can't find their way out. There's a few birds that might perch on the top, but when they've done studies, like it's like literally 3 or 4 birds. There's not very many insects that eat the plants. So you really are going from like a nicer environment to something that's pretty much like a wasteland, even though there's a plant there. So the problem with especially Phragmites and Knotweed is that once they're in the natural environment, as much as we can see above ground, there's actually more underground. So Phragmites have extensive rhizomes, which are like their roots, and they'll just spread for feet. So you can't, if you cut them down, they'll just come back again. The only thing that might work if it's an area that's maintained is if they were actually mowed continuously. You could keep them from getting tall like this. But obviously in natural areas, we don't want to keep mowing this. So yes, normally we do have to treat them with chemicals. But in water, if Phragmites are in water, we actually have a non-chemical technique, which is where we can just cut the stalks. And if they're under a couple feet of water, that'll drown them and kill the roots as well. I'm going to tell you a little bit about CISMA. So CISMA stands for Cooperative Invasive Species Management Area. And these now exist in every county of the state. So Michigan has 21, I think now, and actually might be 22 CISMAs. Well, let me go to the blown up version in a second. But basically, the idea is we all receive some funding from the state of Michigan through a grant program. And we are here as a resource to help people in those areas with anything related to invasive species. So identification, how to control them, doing surveys for them. We answer calls from homeowners. But basically, CISMAs are groups of other partners. So Oakland County CISMA, we have over 40 partners, many of which are the municipalities. But we also partner with like watershed councils and land conservancies and other nonprofits like Oakland University. So CISMAs are basically a collection of other organizations, but we're set up sort of in the same concept of like MDARD has a region and that's your regional contact. CISMAs, it's the same idea. So this way, everyone who lives in any county in the state has someone that they can call, whether they are with a government or just a business or private homeowner. It's someone they can call and ask questions about invasive species. Here's Oakland County. So in Oakland County, our CISMA is just one county, which if you notice on that map, we're the only one that's one county, but given the complexity of there's 62 municipalities and over 10% of the state's population, that's why we just have one county. And then here's the adjoining one. So Mackenzie couldn't make it today, but she's the coordinator for the Lake St Clair CISMA, which is in Macomb and St Clair counties. Patrick is here today. Patrick, wave at everyone. So Patrick is the coordinator for the Gills CISMA, which is in Livingston, Genesee, Shiawassee, and Lapeer. And then the Detroit River Western Lake Erie Cooperative Weed Management Area is in Monroe and Wayne counties. They are housed out of the Nature Conservancy, and they work mostly on the coastal wetlands, but they are starting to do a little bit more in terms of more of the inland things. So, okay, I'm going to go on to talk a little bit about some of these plants. So Japanese knotweed is the one that we're most concerned about, both because of the impacts to their natural environment. So I'll show you a couple of pictures and then I'll go back. So this is something that grows into like big hedges, and you can see the way it grows with all those leaves. It absorbs most of the light in an area. So there's nothing that can live like underneath or around this once it's there. It also spreads. Knotweed has very deep roots that might spread like 10 feet into the ground and then 25 feet to the sides. So we're talking a big area that it can cover once it gets established. This is one of those prohibited plants, as Amy mentioned. So that means you can't cultivate it, transport it, mow it, or other things. And the reason for this designation is because of all these impacts. So this is actually in Farmington. This is a business we went to talk to because someone reported to us that they saw knotweed there, and it's like literally growing out of the base of the building there. And there was actually 2 businesses in Farmington like that. So even in areas that seem to be knotweed is not specific to like more rural or more open areas. There's every bit as much of it in like Ferndale or the more urban areas as there is in the bigger land areas. And I would say the impacts are almost worse in the urban areas for this one just because of what it can do to infrastructure. So Japanese knotweed is perennial. It's an herbaceous shrub. It has what we call simple alternate broad leaves, which just means as you're looking down the stem, the two leaves are not coming off at the same point. Yeah, people do refer to it as Michigan bamboo sometimes. Yeah. And then I'll just show you a few more pictures. So this is a house in Great Britain. Knotweed is really bad there. Like it's caused millions of dollars of damage. And in many cases, they won't sell houses anymore unless there's like an inspection and they know there's no knotweed because of how nasty it is. So we're trying to not get to that point in Michigan. This is what it looks like when it first comes up in the spring. So it looks a lot like asparagus. And that's how people were selling it at Eastern Market. There's a lot of, kind of emphasis on like foraging and, other things that aren't necessarily normally cultivated as food. And like I said, it is edible, but obviously we don't want anyone growing it for any reason. So that would still not be allowed. So this is a couple other pictures, what it looks like in terms of like how you would know that it's knotweed. This banding is really distinctive with knotweed. It's not always green with kind of these red highlights, but it often is. Sometimes the stems themselves are more red, but it always has these nodes, these different parts. And one thing with knotweed, one of the reasons it's so bad about spreading is any of those small sections, and I mean this plant was probably only like this, but it grows really fast. It literally grows inches a day. So sometimes people will really notice that because in their yard they're like, it's grown more than yesterday, and that's true. Any of these small sections, if they're separated from the plant, can grow a new plant. So what happens if people mow it is like it gets mowed out along, and then you can just imagine new plants sprout up as they go. So when they're a little bit taller, they start to look like this, like you'd see the leaves sticking off and the stalks. I would say the stalks are probably the easiest way to tell what it is. And this is just a closer up view showing, again, the stalks, which you can see looks pretty similar to this picture. Here's a picture in late summer, like August and September. It flowers, and the bees actually you will often see bees on it. So it really stands out when it's flowering like that. That's just a close-up view. And then in this time of year, like fall or winter, the stalks will still be there. And it won't grow out of these same stalks the next year. So these actually could be safely like cleared away once you get to this time of year. But underneath the ground, the plant is totally alive still, and new things will sprout up the next year. So like I said, yeah, it could be sold either as food in terms of cutting the stalks of it, or as a plant. All right. So Phragmites we've mentioned several times. Phragmites Australis, it's the invasive Phragmites. There is actually a native Phragmites, but it's not very common. It's a grass that grows up to 20 feet tall, often in these dense monocultures. It has these extensive rhizomes. You might see it used like in art or like various crafts, because people like the look of the tassels on the stalks. So sometimes it has been used in those contexts, like, you can imagine buildings for thatch, or like various sort of art things that you might want to use. Originally, well, I'm not sure if we're totally sure how this got here, but I believe one of the ideas was that it was used as packing material, like in crates when transporting items. So. And it is a restricted plant in Michigan, which still means it's not quite as strong language as prohibited, but it does mean that it's a regulated plant. So there are rules about it. When it first comes up, it looks kind of like this over here. You can see the kind of new stalks just coming up. A lot of people say it looks kind of like corn, because it is just like sort of a thin stalk, and then the leaves will pop off like that. It doesn't tassel until August usually, and then these stalks, these browner ones, those are actually dead. So either they've been killed by frost from previous years, or potentially sprayed by chemicals and killed that way. So it'll stay that color but in the winter it'll turn brown like that. But these stalks have a lot of strength, so they'll actually stay standing there for several years, even if they have been treated, whether they're alive or not. Here's some other pictures of why it's a problem. So this is actually a lake inside of here, but it is surrounded by feet thick of Phragmites all along the edges of the lake. And here's another picture. So looking along a river, and you can just see the Phragmites on either side. So this spreads very readily, which is another reason that we try to we don't want people to be spreading it. Tassels are seeds, and it does spread by seeds. It also spreads, like, if it's close by, it can actually spread via the rhizomes. And knotweed is actually the same problem. It spreads readily. The knotweed stalks actually float on the water. So if there's like a flood or we have a really wet spring, it can actually flood up and then take that wherever the water is headed. So part of the restrictions in that legislation mean that you can't transport it, for example. Even though it's not prohibited, it still can't be transported. So they really can't actually carry a permit so that we can transport it just for like educational purposes. But if we do that, we always spray the tassels with paint or something to make sure, put them in a plastic bag so that nothing's spreading. So we're not going to eliminate Phragmites from this area. Yeah, it doesn't mean that it's not worth trying to contain it. And like one of the other reasons that we treat it on the roadways is because that can be a method of spread if it's on the roadways, especially if they're using equipment and everything, so they're spreading it that way. But there's so much of it, and there's no authority to require people to treat, for example, on their properties. Although actually some of the townships in this area have passed ordinances for Phragmites specifically that say that if it's not treated even on someone's private property, then the township has the option to come in and have it treated and charge them for it. So there are some townships that have gotten pretty serious about it to try to get that more overall. But I would say it's still unlikely that we're going to eliminate it. But that's not to say that we should just kind of let it keep going, because unfortunately we're really losing a lot of nice wetland habitat when it's doing this. So, yeah. All right. Okay. So purple loosestrife, heard that one mentioned. So it is a perennial. It has these nice, pretty purple flowers, but in wetland habitats, it'll spread, and kind of like you can see in this picture, but it'll just sort of like Phragmites. It won't grow as much like throughout the water, but it will spread all along the edges of lakes, for example, or other areas. So wetland habitats are where it's a big problem. They have these magenta flower spikes, and it's a restricted species in Michigan. So purple loosestrife is actually in better shape now than it was for a while. And the reason for this, I forget if I put it in here. I didn't put it in here. The reason is we actually have a biological control. So there's a beetle that only eats purple loosestrife that was developed and was released. And so it does keep it more under control than it would be without the beetle. So that's good from a management standpoint. It still won't eliminate it, but the idea is to keep it with all the invasive species. Is we don't necessarily always need to eliminate them to get the goal that we're going towards, but we need to find a way of reducing them to a level where the natives and other species can compete better. So we're kind of trying to reestablish that natural balance. Yeah. Well, the other thing that I'll talk about is that some markets, and I think Oakland County market is doing this now, is like, just because, I mean, I guess the sort of minimum level is to not sell the prohibited species and have the restricted species. But some markets or some areas have gone a step further on that, and they might say, you know, in that area, we're asking you not to sell these other species as well because they are invasive, even if they're not, it's not against the law to do so. We don't want you to do so because of the impacts on the environment. So it kind of depends on the area in terms of like what the, how they might deal with that. But yeah, that one specifically I can look into and let you know whether it's invasive or not. And I'll get into that with the aquatics, because some of these, so what we call the watch list, these are species that are not widespread in Michigan right now. So some of them are present in Michigan, but they're like localized, and some of them are not present in Michigan yet, but if they got here, they would be a big problem. So these are ones that basically we're trying to prevent from becoming widespread. And these include everything from crayfish, which I'll talk about a little bit, to some of the aquatic plants. These ones over here, I don't have big pictures of them, but these are ones that are legal for sale: water hyacinth, water lettuce, and water clover. But these are ones that are invasive, and sometimes people will say, especially with these two, water hyacinth and lettuce, that they won't overwinter, but the problem is they have been found in natural environments, and they're spreading. So that suggests that it's not an issue of the environment will control it. So these ones are pretty commonly sold, especially these two, water hyacinth and water lettuce, and for people's like backyard ponds. But you can imagine, like, if there's a flood or something, like those plants could spread out to other areas, and that has happened. Or sometimes people may just release them out into a pond because they don't want them anymore for some reason. The issue is, of course, with any of these, the more of them that there are and the more that are being released, you know, some plants are also able to, like over time, they may actually be able to get more adapted to the environment. But these ones definitely have been found. Like, it's not that they just go in there and then they die. They definitely are able to live, at least in the environment, yeah. These are ones that we're especially concerned about, basically. We want to catch them early so that they don't become widespread. There's a bunch of these, and they're all on that list back there, so you can check it out. These ones on the top in this graphic have been found in the wild in Michigan, and the ones down here have never been found. So like I said, they're starting to, with the regulations, they're starting to go earlier in the process, which is if these are invasive in other states or other areas, and there's a possibility that they could come to Michigan, then we're going to make them prohibited now before they become widespread and to try to keep them out. I'm just going to talk about two of them more specifically because these both have been found live in Oakland County in our natural environment. So European frogbit is actually, we have a bit of an infestation of it in the Novi area. And we'll actually, the CISMA will be doing surveys with the watershed councils this year to try to get a better sense of where it is. Hopefully it's just isolated in the Novi area, but it may not be. So frogbit is relatively common, or at least found more commonly in the Great Lakes, but it's relatively uncommon inland. So that's why we're concerned about its move from the Great Lakes to inland. This is another kind of cute plant. It looks pretty, gets a little white flower on it. It's free floating, so it's not rooted. But the problem is, and actually I didn't put that picture in here, but basically it fills in an entire, like the entire top of the pond would just be covered with frogbit plants, like thick, like you could pick it up, that many plants. So it's obviously has a big impact on the environment at that point because not much else can live there, and it shades out the light for the other organisms. So we're trying to catch this early. Since it's free floating, it can literally float to new areas as well as being spread by boats and other methods. So this is one, I don't know if it's ever been found. Well, I know that you could order it online, I believe, and because it's a little bit harder to regulate online businesses, but it certainly is possible that someone would have this for sale here, and it is a prohibited plant, so people can't raise it, sell it, transport it, even if it's dead. None of those things are allowed. And then the other one that I'll talk about is yellow floating heart. So this was found, it appears to have been released into a pond by Red Oaks Nature Center in Madison Heights. So there were at least several plants of it, and luckily they were found and pulled out, and thus it appears to have not been there long enough to get established. But many of these water plants are tricky because they'll actually drop, this is called a turion, and it's an overwintering bud. So what happens is it drops that bud and it falls to the bottom of whatever lake or river or stream that it's in, and then the next year it pops up and a new little plant pops out of that. So It's good for it. It has a nice reproductive method, but it's bad for us because it means the more years that it's there, the more of these buds that it's dropped, and the more plants are going to come up in future years, the harder it is to get rid of. Okay. One other one that I'll mention is red swamp crayfish. This is also present in Oakland County, the southern part of Oakland County. And the DNR Fisheries Division is doing a lot of trapping to try to prevent it from spreading further. One reason that these are tough to get rid of is that they can go over land for up to a mile, so they can literally just walk to new water bodies. And they're really aggressive crayfish. This is actually the reason I put it on here is that sometimes these are the ones that are used like in school projects or could be sold by, probably not in farmers markets, but businesses that sell like aquarium animals. These are often, they can be dyed colors and sold. So they're really aggressive compared to our native crayfish. And so they outcompete all the native crayfish. And then they also cause issues because they like to dig these big burrows, which is how they overwinter. And if there's any like earthen dams in the area, you can imagine it's not good to have a bunch of things digging holes through all the earthen dams. So there's a lot of work going into the red swamp crayfish to try to prevent them from spreading, but they are in a number of still isolated areas right now in the southern part of the county. Okay. Yeah, so as Amy said, she has a whole list back there. You can also go on the michigan.gov website, and they have pictures with with the names next to them and whether they're prohibited or restricted. So that could also be a nice way to just kind of browse through, or you could print out a copy so at least you kind of know what they look like. Yes, I want to thank all of those people. And then did I put in here? Okay. Just wanted to say, if you're ever wondering just like what is this plant or something, you can always send us a picture. If you don't want to go directly to Amy, I'm sure Amy's happy to help you too. But if you're just wondering like what is this, and even if it's just you on your personal property or whatever, that's what we're here for. So we're happy to help. So we don't expect you to figure out how to identify everything. But the thing is, just having more eyes and ears out there, knowing kind of what things could be an issue really helps us out, because obviously we can't be everywhere at the same time. So, and we do collect all this data too. So we're collecting and mapping, and we do survey some parts of the county. So we're getting more and more data on these and where they are to try to help control them.